This week's episode is sponsored by Easy Roller Dice.
RPG players can never have enough dice, and these affordable and high-quality dice are perfect for building a personalized collection on a lightweight budget.
Their dice come in a huge range of colors, materials, and fonts, so you can have the perfect set to match your characters, spells, and monsters.
We've been using their awesome dice trays at our own game table to keep all of our dice in one place for years now.
Visit EasyRollerDice.com or follow the links in the description below to visit their online store.
You'll also find below our discount code, which you can use to save on select purchases.
And now, on to this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are taking an in-depth look at the Cleric subclasses in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We're going to be going through all the Cleric subclasses and ranking them, figuring out which ones are the best domains to swear your divine allegiance to, and which ones you might want to reconsider. Now, of course, the Cleric is one of the most blessed classes in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and that's not just because they are such divinely blessed characters. That's because they have 12 different subclasses in the published books to choose from, second only to the Wizard. Because of this, we have decided to split this into two videos. We're going to be covering 6 of the Cleric subclasses in this video, starting with the Arcana Domain all the way to the Life Domain. Then we're going to be covering the Light Domain to the War Domain and wrapping up in the second part of this video. That way we don't have to be here for over an hour discussing all 12 of the Cleric subclasses at once.
The other thing to keep in mind with the Cleric subclasses is that the Cleric subclasses actually offer only a few features and a spell list to the Cleric itself. The Cleric itself is already a really, really strong class. For that reason, it was actually quite difficult to rank these, and we actually found that there really isn't a bad choice for a Cleric subclass. When you look at the Cleric as a whole, they have some of the best spell options in the game, some of the most versatility in the game, and can be used in a lot of different ways. So really, depending on the flavor that you are going for with your Cleric, there's going to be a subclass that suits that need. So some of the ones that we rank a little lower might still be the best choice for you because of the way you want to design your Cleric. Some of the ones that we rank higher, they might be stronger choices overall, but you're not going to be diminished by any choice that you make with a Cleric subclass. That being said, we are trying to rank them up against each other, and if you look on the screen right now, you're going to see the criteria that we used to rank the subclasses. So we go from S tier to D tier, looking at the features and traits available in the subclass and trying to determine which ones amplify the class itself far beyond what its regular capabilities are, and which ones might diminish or take away or land somewhere in the middle. So we're going to look at all of those today and try to determine what the strongest subclasses are for the Cleric.
As a general principle, we prefer class features that are available earlier and are broadly applicable in many common adventuring situations. A class feature that is awesome, but that you will never use or will rarely use in a handful of encounters throughout a campaign is not as good as a class feature or a benefit that will apply in almost every single combat encounter or very common adventuring situations. As usual as well, we're not assessing these subclasses based on their flavor or role-playing potential because we believe that all of these offer great role-playing opportunities, and for that reason, the role-playing is not really a metric that we can compare these subclasses against each other on.
All Cleric subclasses are going to have a similar structure to one another. They're going to give you your domain spells, which are automatically prepared. They're going to give you your channel divinity ability, and they're going to give you a cool capstone ability and maybe a couple other options as well. So when we're looking at them, we really want to look at the spell list presented in the domain spells and what the channel divinity option is and how those stack up against the rest of the options presented. There's a lot to look at today, so let's get rolling.
The first Cleric domain we're going to look at today is the Arcana Domain, introduced in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, which covers worshippers and clerics of the gods of magic that inhabit the multiverses of Dungeons & Dragons. The spell list is interesting but somewhat bland. It's cool to get Dispel Magic, Arcane Eye, Magic Missile, and Teleportation Circle, but those don't really add anything to the Cleric kit that Clerics couldn't access through some of the other spells that they get anyways. The Channel Divinity option, which allows you to turn a Fey or Fiend or Celestial or Elemental creature, is interesting, but again, it may or may not come up all the time. The best feature that this class gets is its Capstone ability, which is not gained until 17th level, when you're able to choose a 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th level wizard spell and add those to your Cleric spell list. So naturally, you're going to choose Wish, Simulacrum, Contingency, and something super awesome that you totally love, in which case the subclass is amazing. Overall, for me, I think that these features are pretty limited, and I give this subclass a C. I think that the features here are not useless, they're just not always that useful. Although, getting Wish at 17th level is amazing, and if you're playing at 17th, 18th, 19th, or 20th level, I think the subclass is probably an A then. But before that, it's a C to me.
I completely agree with you. I also ranked this subclass a C. For a lot of the same reasons you did, I do find that when we look at most of the pre-written campaign modules or a lot of homebrew campaigns, they don't often go past level 15, 16, or 17, meaning that the one ability that truly stands out for this subclass is something that most players will never see. And if you are going to be playing a high-level game, then by all means, this is an excellent option. And dipping into the wizard is a really cool concept, so I do think that it is better than a D rank. But its Channel Divinity only targets one creature, which I think if it targeted more, it could be better. And the spell list is mostly comprised of relatively situational spells. There's nothing here that you're going to be happy to have and be dishing out all the time. There's mostly spells that are going to maybe come up a few times so that you're like, oh, that's cool that I have that. So at the end of the day, it doesn't add anything essential to the Cleric that the Cleric itself doesn't already have. It doesn't bolster anything. It doesn't really change the Cleric in any meaningful way. It's really just a neat flavor for the Cleric.
Our community actually liked the Arcana Domain. 30% of respondents gave it an A, 41% of people gave it a B, and even 12.5% of people gave it the S tier ranking. And again, I simply have to say that I think that this is overstating the power of the 17th level capstone feature. It's amazing. It is great. Don't get me wrong on that. It is a really, really good capstone feature. It just, for 90% of the campaign, it's not relevant.
Spellbreaker is a really cool ability, and perhaps there's a lot of people who really love using this ability to dispel a spell with your healing abilities. But I don't see them adding in a huge meaningful way to the Cleric.
So are we going to hold steady with our C ranking?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the Arcane Mastery ability makes this subclass look better than it is, and you're just going to spend most of the time waiting for that high-level capstone ability, and in a lot of campaigns, you just aren't going to reach that far.
Next up, we come to the Death Domain Cleric, which is presented in the player's handbook. The Death Domain Cleric adds a lot of necromantic energies into the Cleric, which is really cool. The spell list presented is kind of lackluster in my opinion. What you end up getting here are some really cool necromancy spells, but most of them are already on the Cleric spell list. If you're excited about Animate Dead, you could already take that. It might be neat that it's already prepared for you, and that way you could pick a different spell, but I actually don't think a lot of the spells presented here are worth it enough that you would be excited to take them. The only one that really stands out to me that isn't normally on the list is Cloudkill, which you get at 9th level. So that is the one standout to me on the spell list, but having only one standout doesn't make this an amazing subclass. When we look at the abilities, you get proficiency in martial weapons, but not armor. So if you're looking at this thinking, I can be a frontline cleric, you're still going to have the problem with not being able to wear heavy armor. And a lot of the abilities are adding necrotic damage or doing other sort of necromancy flavored things, but it kind of feels like this subclass maybe doesn't know what direction it wants to go. You have a spattering of concepts to help you out a little bit with necromantic spell casting, and you have a spattering of options that help you out with combat. And yeah, it's cool to be able to cast a necromantic spell and target 2 creatures, but they do need to be standing within 5 feet of each other, which is actually a little more situational than it immediately appears when you read this. For these reasons, I'm giving the Death Domain Cleric a C ranking as well.
I am intensely disappointed in the Death Domain Cleric. It is presented as a villainous class option in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I would have expected a bunch of features that would augment undead minions and really make it a Cleric Necromancer. But that's not what this subclass is. It's really some sort of Death Mage class that is augmenting some necrotic damage-dealing spells by letting you target more than one creature. But of course, targeting more than one creature with necrotic spells is something that only applies to cantrips until 17th level. And being able to target 2 creatures with, say, Inflict Wounds, or Vampiric Touch, or Blight, or Contagion, or even being able to target 2 creatures with Raise Dead and Revivify, which are also necromancy spells, that's a cool ability. 17th level kind of feels late for that ability to be coming online. And so this doesn't really present a coherent playstyle and seems to want to encourage you to take the necrotic damage dealing spells that clerics have, when really a cleric that is using Spiritual Weapon and Spirit Guardians and other amazing spells like Guiding Bolt and Flame Strike is probably going to be performing better against many enemies like undead foes, which actually the Death Domain Cleric is pretty bad at fighting because those foes are resistant to poison and necrotic damage. So I think that this subclass is a solid C, and if you play too far into it, I think it's actually a borderline D in that respect, because the necrotic and poison damage that this subclass gives you is not nearly as good as the force and radiant damage dealing spells that clerics already get.
I think that when you look at the ways that this amplifies necrotic spells, the other thing to take into account is if you're trying to dish out damage, necrotic spells are never your best choice. So it's just not going to stand up to all of the other amazing cleric spell options. And yes, you can still have those cleric spell options, and then you're going to be getting these necrotic options. But why would you ever pick the necrotic options? Even if they're amplified to be almost as good as the other options that you already have.
Looking at our community poll, 7.8% gave this the S rank, 28.7% gave it the A, 44.6% gave it the B tier, and 14.9% gave it C, and another 4% gave it D. I don't know what people see in this.
Again, if we're comparing all the subclasses, I don't see how this one ranks better than a lot of the other options presented.
I think people think this is the Necromancer Cleric, and it's not. A lot of people put a lot of weight in the 17th level features, because on paper it looks like clerics don't get a lot of abilities from their subclass. So it tends to make that 17th level feature look like something that comes online much earlier than it does. And in many ways, those features are very transformative, like they are with the Death Domain. But it just comes too late to make a big difference.
A 17th level feature is something that you definitely need to take into account. And there's a lot of cool abilities, but I mean, campaigns don't usually go that long. And if they do, you're only playing for a few months with that ability, after playing for like a year with your friends of not having that ability. So we take them into account, and I think that, like, yeah, the 17th level ability is cool. It is really cool. But I'm going to use it a handful of times through my entire lifespan with this character.
And you can take the Death Domain and never cast any of the spells on the list and be fine.
Next up, for all of you players out there who love the Dwarven Cleric build, who were waiting for the perfect domain to choose, the Forge domain was introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and it is a really cool subclass and really drives home that worship of the god of the Forge and the god of material and building, and it has a lot of really cool aspects to it. For instance, the spell list presented, I actually think is one of the stronger spell lists that you get. It has really cool options like Wall of Fire, which is one of my favorite spells, as well as a smite spell, Searing Smite, that can just enhance your combat prowess. You get proficiency in heavy armor. You get the ability at first level to create a magical weapon or magical armor, which at first level is pretty insane. You get a +1 weapon or a +1 armor, already tanking up your AC, and then later on you get another ability that allows you to add another +1 to your AC. So if you're this Forge Domain Cleric wearing heavy armor, making it magical, +2 to your AC, and you have like a shield and a warhammer, you're running in, smiting guys, casting fire, eventually you get resistance to fire damage, later on at 17th level, immunity to fire damage. There's a lot that this domain actually offers, and for the person who is interested in playing the Forge Domain Cleric, they are going to get a lot of value out of it. Their Channel Divinity allows you to create small little trinkets and items that can be used in a number of different ways. So not only are you doubling down on the tankiness of this class, the fire smitingness of this class, the ability to build and manipulate items, but it's all just put together in this package that really influences a lot of different aspects of the game. And for this reason, I actually give the Forge Domain an S tier ranking. I think it's one of the strongest subclasses that was presented and fits a really nice category that I think the Cleric needed and a lot of players wanted.
The Forge Domain Cleric gains 2 of the best spells in the game that are not normally available to clerics on their spell list: Heat Metal and Animate Objects. Both of which are incredibly versatile spells that have applications both in combat and outside of combat. Their ability with the Blessings of the Forge to create small items is an invitation to so many different types of creativity, and this is also reflected in their spell list for building objects and items. It encourages you to think of the game world in a much more interactive way, one that facilitates craftsmanship, building, and planning. The progression of defensive features, starting off with heavy armor proficiency, being able to make that suit of magic armor or make that magic weapon that you can give to another party member if you need to, or use for yourself. The escalation of fire resistance up to fire immunity, and then the +1 to AC when you're wearing heavy armor, that then also as the capstone gives you resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, creates a really lovely progression in the overall building of this class. It is perfect for a dwarf, and I do think that it scratches that S tier. I'm going to give it an A myself, but it's an A+ here. I don't know if it's transformative in the way that I normally want to see for an S tier character. It's still going to play a lot like a typical cleric, except you're really tanky, you're really tough, and you've got a lot of fun stuff to do both in and out of combat. So I think it's really strong.
So let's take a look at what our community has to say about the Forge Cleric and whether or not they agree with us.
30% of respondents gave it a S tier ranking, just like Kelly. 41.7% giving it an A tier, and 22.6% giving it the B tier. I think with a spread like this, I'm much more confident in giving it an S. I think it's a fantastic subclass and definitely one of the best cleric domains. Also introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything was the Grave Domain Cleric, which in many ways is a bit of a counterpart to the Death Domain Cleric. One that is focused on the passage of life into death and is presented in its flavor as actually resisting undead and being more focused around that gentle passage. The Grave Domain spell list is actually quite similar to the Death Domain spell list, just with a few swaps here and there, putting back Revivify and Raise Dead into the list and putting in an interesting spell like Bane. It also gets Anti-Life Shell. Again, the things in here are very situational or spells that you'll probably never use at all. The spell list is nothing special, but the class features are. Circle of Mortality is excellent for bringing fallen allies back into the fight. One of the worst things that can ever happen in this game is for an ally to get knocked down and then to be brought back up again with Healing Word, but they only got a handful of hit points, which isn't enough to survive taking another hit. So they aren't truly brought back into the fight. Circle of Mortality solves this problem. Their Channel Divinity, Path to the Grave, is absolutely amazing. In particular, if you have a paladin or a rogue in your party, or another damage-dealing character that can deliver a really big hit, because you're able to have one of your enemies have vulnerability to the damage from that attack. This is why it's so good with Sneak Attack and Divine Smite and similar abilities, because the damage from that attack basically gets doubled. So your already amazing Paladin Nova or Assassin Sneak Attack just is kicked into overdrive by your very presence. Finally, I think one of the coolest and most frustrating abilities for me is Sentinel at Death's Door, which allows you to negate critical hits against your ally. I did not realize how powerful this ability was until Kelly used it we ran a Curse of Strahd one-shot where we did just Castle Ravenloft, and this ability saved the party. I was rolling some hot dice that night, and being able to negate critical hit after critical hit kept people in the game. It was really, really good, and made me feel as the DM like Kelly was messing with me. It's always great when you get an ability that lets you mess with the DM's die rolls. The other abilities are pretty good as well. I was tempted to give this one a B because the spell list is pretty disappointing. But I think the class features really make up for it. They come online early enough that they're super relevant throughout the entire campaign, and they'll be useful time and time again in some of the most desperate adventuring situations. So for that, I think I'm going to give it an A.
I have to completely agree with you. I'm also giving this subclass an A. Now, I'm a little biased in the fact that this is one of my favorite classes that I have played in a one-shot. And yes, shutting down Monty's critical hits was one of the greatest joys I've ever had playing Dungeons & Dragons. But that in itself says volumes about this subclass. The only reason why it doesn't get an S tier ranking for me is because of the spell list. If the spell list had a few spells that made me go, oh man, I want that spell so bad, it would have bumped it up to S tier. But because it doesn't have that, because the spells are relatively lackluster, except for a few that are, oh, that's cool, it falls safely in the A category for me. I think that this is one of the stronger subclasses for the Cleric. I think the abilities are fun, they are useful time and time again, and they're just exciting to see come to life at the table. And I think the whole flavor of this subclass, just you can feel it through. Unlike the Death Domain, the Grave Domain, I think, is much more coherent and shows exactly what it wants to be as you read through the class abilities. So I'm putting it as an A tier ranking. What does our community think?
31.4 give it the S tier ranking, 35.2 give it the A tier ranking, and 25.9 gave the Grave Domain Cleric a B, with the remainder giving it a C and a very thin sliver of the D rank. I think pretty conclusively this puts it in the A tier. Absolutely. There's an kind of equal balance between people who agree or disagree, whether it's S or not, that it falls very solidly into that mid-range. There's a very clear high end of this. It's A+ for sure. Knowledge is power, and those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But unfortunately these days, the only thing that a history degree will actually get you is a job teaching history for the next 40 years. And I find that the Knowledge Domain Cleric occupies the same position. There's lots of useful things in this subclass. Gaining some really cool spells of the divination type, like Augury, Identify, Scrying, and Legend Lore, many of which are already on the Cleric spell list. Being able to get double your proficiency modifier in 2 of the knowledge skills, compensating for the fact that you probably don't have a high intelligence score as a cleric, and be able to use Channel Divinity to gain proficiency in a skill or tool. All of these things are useful, just super situational. And I think the combined effect of this is that you'll be glad you know these things when they come up. But you're still going to be relying on the bread and butter of what makes a cleric great so much with this subclass anyways, that I really hesitate to give this anything higher than a C ranking.
I have to agree with you. I think the Knowledge Domain Cleric is definitely a C tier. It doesn't take away from the Cleric in any way, but when you look at its features, they're very situational. Even the spell list is mostly spells that you could already pick up. You do get Arcane Eye and Suggestion, which are awesome spells, so that is one little thumbs up for it. When we look at their abilities, clerics aren't really the skill junkie that a rogue or a bard is, so doubling down on some of your skills, giving yourself bonuses, bonus proficiencies, or since you're a wisdom-based class, you're probably already going to have proficiency in perception, and you're not really going to be relying on a lot of the intelligence-based features. Now, being able to give yourself proficiency in something that you're not good at could save you on a roll that you would otherwise fail sometimes, but it's just really going to make you okay at things you were bad at, and the things you were good at, it's not really going to change in any meaningful way.
Some DMs love having players make Arcana and history and religion and knowledge checks because they really have that information tied to recognizing and identifying monsters. Maybe that rises the stock of the knowledge domain a little bit, but because the rules of 5th edition D&D are not really clear on how players use knowledge skills to gain information about monsters and then translating that into actionable things is not clear either, it really makes this ability very fuzzy in its usefulness and solidifies it as a C ranking for me.
So what does our community have to say about the knowledge domain?
Again, 22% of respondents gave it an A tier. As always, I think that the A rankings here are just clerics are great, which they are. 49% give it a B, and 19% gave it a C, with some small slivers in the S and the D camps. That solidly from the community puts it as a B ranking, and I'm inclined to just be a little corrective there and say, no, I think it's a C. I think we can do a lot better here.
Again, I think if people are playing in campaigns where these abilities become useful regularly, it becomes a B tier class. But that is so limited, and I think that this is C. Lastly, we come to the Cleric of Clerics, the Life Domain. These worshippers of gods of life and goodness are the frontrunners for what everybody imagines the cleric to be, the greatest healer on the battlefield. Now, with the Life Domain, you get the greatest hits for your spell list. You get a bunch of spells that are already available to the cleric. But the one benefit here is that by taking these, you already have most of the best spells that you would have taken anyway, allowing you to choose other, more versatile spells when you're looking at the spells you're going to choose. So it actually does open this up a bit, and even though all of these spells are available to the cleric already, they're all great and all useful. Your ability to enhance your healing is extremely useful, and you have a lot of different options here for how to use healing and how to enhance and keep people alive on the battlefield. This cleric domain is the poster child of clerics. I think that a lot of people who look at the cleric think of a healer first. And this is actually why I give this an A tier and not an S tier. Because a lot of people who look at the cleric and gravitate towards life are under the impression that healing is the best thing that you can do as a cleric. And that's just not the case. So I think that the Life Domain Cleric actually lends itself to a really powerful build, but can actually steer people in the wrong direction with the cleric, where they aren't taking advantage of a lot of the other aspects that this class has to offer. Clerics can be amazing in combat. They can be amazing healers. They can be amazing spellcasters. They can be frontline defenders. And the Life Domain Cleric can actually be all of those things. So I think it borders on the S tier, but I do think that a lot of people come into this particular subclass thinking that they're going to be a heal bot, and that's not necessarily the right way to go with it.
I agree. The Life Domain Cleric has S tier features for a D tier playstyle, and that is healing. The spell list doubles down on the spells that you were just going to be taking anyways with almost every cleric. You add Guiding Bolt and Spirit Guardians to this spell list, and your cleric is basically off to the races. The extra points of healing on every healing spell you cast are lovely and take healing spells from being kind of meh overall to being pretty good options. But I would still never cast a healing spell on a player character that does not immediately need that attention. Triage is a critical skill to have as a life domain cleric. And knowing when to use your healing spells and when to not use your healing spells is vitally important. If you stand there using your main action to cast Cure Wounds to top up the fighter, as if you were playing World of Warcraft and you're playing a priest, you are not really getting the most out of what your cleric is capable of. If you're doing things really, really well in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you can win without taking damage. Thus, it is possible for a life domain cleric to actually be dead weight in a party that is well constructed and works together with great teamwork. And now that I'm saying a well-constructed party that works together with great teamwork and has excellent planning, I'm realizing that party never existed and never actually happens. So there's like this theoretical side of things where the life domain cleric is actually really, really bad, because if you need, but the practical reality of it is that everything about this is great. Yes, it's combat focused. There's really not any abilities that the life domain cleric gets that are not related to healing people that are getting beaten up in combat. But you are free to take all the other amazing spells that clerics get to fulfill those purposes, because your spell list is covered. So I'm a little conflicted about the life domain cleric. On paper, I both oscillate between giving it an S ranking and giving it a D ranking. And I don't think it would be my first pick by a mile for any cleric that I would play. And in particular, I think Dungeon Masters love the life domain cleric because Dungeon Masters love to beat up the player characters. Like, DMs feel like they have failed if they haven't delivered a combat encounter that doesn't beat the players up and cause them to take a bunch of damage. They'll always escalate things. So DMs love seeing the life domain cleric because it's like a nice security blanket. So for that reason, I think I'm going to give it the S tier myself and say this is amazing. It's probably overall good for the game. But I do think that if you let yourself be shoehorned by what this subclass offers, you might be in for a boring time playing a heal bot, which nobody wants to do.
So what does our community have to say about the life domain?
48% of people gave it the S tier ranking, which is the most heavily leaning ranking of all the S tier rankings of all the cleric subclasses. The remaining 39.9% gave it an A, with less than 10% of respondents giving it a B or less. So I think I have to agree with them. I think people think that healing is powerful, and healing is, because I think it reflects a way that actual campaigns get played a lot. I just do want to reiterate, don't be a heal bot. Don't fall victim to the top-up video game style of healing. We got a whole video on how to play a healer in D&D 5e. Check that out. We got some good advice in there.
There was something very important that you stated, and that is we have talked time and time again about how healing is inefficient in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But the life domain cleric gives you a top-up on that actually makes it more efficient. Mm-hmm. So if you are going to be using healing, this is the subclass to play. So we've looked at 6 of the cleric subclasses out of their total of 12, being one of the most versatile classes in the game for the choice that they get. Next time we'll be looking at the light to war domain cleric options and stacking those up against the options we presented today and taking a look at their abilities and features and seeing which subclasses out of those are as good as the ones that we presented today or fall somewhere in the middle. So stay tuned for that, and you'll get the full package on cleric subclasses soon.
Well, the Forge domain and the Life domain are real standouts. The next couple cleric subclasses also have some really premium picks, so we'll see how that all shakes out in the next video.
So this has been part 1 of our look at cleric subclasses in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about your favorite subclass options in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. We thank each and every one of you deeply. If you enjoy the work that we create here on YouTube, please consider checking us out on Patreon by following the links in the description below.
Don't forget to check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern at twitch.tv/dungeon_dudes. You can find all the previous episodes from that campaign right up over here.
And we have plenty more guides and rankings to the classes in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.